Yashin?
I think the globalization. I think if I were Singapore, I would say globalization is very important. Costa Rica, yes. Puerto Rico, but for these two continental countries, at the best, FDI as a percentage share of the GDP and fixed asset investment is in a single digit, right? So, and it's mostly located in certain regions, but not in other regions. I think if globalization is a proxy for liberalization on many other dimensions, then sometimes you miss. Sometimes you can overestimate the effect of globalization when in effect it is the other things that you do that are closely correlated with globalization that deliver a growth and things like that. Shenzhen, usually is celebrated as a globalization story, and it is absolutely part of that. When I was visiting Shenzhen in the early 1990s, I was really struck by how many domestic entrepreneurs that I ran into in Shenzhen who couldn't start their businesses in Liaoning and Jilin and in these state-owned provinces. They went to Shenzhen. And then later on, I look at the data. Domestic private entrepreneurship in Shenzhen was extremely important. Although we usually attribute the success of Shenzhen to FDI, when in fact it was really the more permissive environment that created the economic growth. So I'm not disagreeing with you, but I guess I'm more agreeing with Tarun. It's an issue of how much credit you gave to globalization vis-a-vis what I think are more important drivers of growth: domestic policies, social policies, human capital policies. I think there's a very interesting comment about political economy. There's no question political economy matters. I mean, I agree with that 100%. The issue is that do we think about political economy as a binary, simplistic categorization between one-party system and democratic system? I'm not saying democracy is always good. There are lots of bad democracies. All I'm saying is that just looking at these two countries, the picture is not that clear. In fact, this is, Tarun and I are looking at the same academic research. Statistically, it's a wash. It's a wash. You have very successful one-party systems. You have disastrous one-party systems. Statistically, they offset each other. They don't really see much. But political economy, absolutely, very important. And Passenger made the point that Indian elites are somehow captured by the rural elites, by these. I disagree with Passenger a little bit about the land reforms in India. I thought the land reforms in India were extremely incomplete. And
I agree.
Yeah, so even though 40%, and they were captured by the local landed class, and then they had a very incomplete land reforms, unlike Korea, unlike Taiwan. So the failure of the land reforms in India, you can make the argument were due to the incompleteness of the reforms, rather than that land reforms didn't produce the effects. Political economy, absolutely. That's absolutely the right way of looking at these two countries.
First let me make that correction. I guess I was going very speedily to my, I certainly operate on the assumption that land reform was a failure, but I just wanted to show that actually in the total amount of land, it was more than all of that, but that's nothing. That's a drop in the bucket for India. And in fact, my main narrative there tried to show how they abandoned agriculture in some ways and went for food aid and then Green Revolution and things like that. So that was the first thing. On the issue of local capacity building, I think that's very interesting. This is a puzzle that is probably goes back to the same factors. And I think, democracy maybe have been overplayed, but it certainly plays a role in combination with other factors, which is the argument that I'm trying to make, right? The success of Chinese reforms happened with decentralization, right? Each tub on its own bottom, the zifu ying kui, right? And that kind of thing. And so that was, that's the kind of thing where you unleash local initiative, right? Everybody remembers the time from the 80s when every petty official you met wanted to have some business dealing with you, no matter what an impoverished academic you might be. If you were from abroad, you must have, yes, they have the incentive. You don't see anything like that in India, you know. And I don't see how and why, even with all this urban rebuilding missions and so on, you have a very hard time. And there I think it is local party politics and central local relations and so on that make a difference. On the other hand, you know, this is also the problem for China. This decentralization has also been a problem, and it's been very hard to sort of rein them back in, and this is a continuing battle. But at least you had a lot of growth, right? Well, maybe it wasn't all worth it. But on the issue of globalization, I think it's very important to see that in some ways the globalization may be much more important going the reverse way rather than this way. I mean, you know, capital now is no longer just from the core regions in the old Wallastinian kind of world economy systems. Now capital is dezonalized, I think. And I think the kinds of avenues that Chinese capital in particular, but also Indian capital, has globally makes for many more changes within the societies that they are in, but also in the societies where they're coming from, than we've begun to recognize. And there are all kinds of pressures to create, you know, this whole idea of these, it's not a homogeneous economic political space anymore. It's really connections of hubs with hubs. And what is the relationship to the hinterland is very complex, I think. I mean, this is trying to, I'm not giving enough specificity here, but I think we need to put globalization on a much more complex terrain to see its effects.
Just had one comment on this issue of, you know, how do politicians capture rents in some sense, and therefore presumably that's one of the incentives for them to go into politics. I'm assuming in some other than idealism and so on. There's a very interesting paper presented just last week at Harvard by one of my students who is specialized in measuring rent seeking over the last 20 years. He's a fellow named Raymond Fissman at Columbia. But he presented this really interesting study where he was estimating what are the returns to being a politician in fast-growing India today. And his estimate was 15%, right? So he has, you know, there are all these studies always come with a host of caveats, but it was a very clever, systematic attempt to say, on average, what does it pay? And in the discussion, I said, there's no way I'd be a politician if all you can make is 15% returns in an economy that's going at that speed, right? Any private entrepreneur worth his or her salt today makes 40 or 50% returns in a country like India. So that sort of, to me, answered the question of why aren't people going into politics to some extent. That really the money that's being made through corruption and capture of elite, et cetera, that various panelists have spoken of, is really accruing to very few. And this is also what he shows. There are a small segment of people who win the tournament, if you will, and capture most of the rents. But for the vast majority, it's like a lottery that didn't pan out. And you know, and I'm sure he'll get a lot of pushback from the scholarly process. But I thought it was a very insightful study, and in some sense, it frames the question interestingly. So I thought I'd offer that because I do think that it's the allocation of human capital in the aggregate that's the primary driver of the right policy choices, therefore the right institutional changes, and ultimately ergo of growth. And by not focusing on that, which is why I was emphasizing my comments on education ultimately, we're sort of missing the forest for the trees.
Thank you all very much for these comments. And we'll now take a 15-minute break. There should be coffee available for you upstairs. And then please come back to hear about the bottom-up perspective on these problems. We'll move from a macro level to a micro level.